She stood in that courtroom, worn clothes and trembling hands, begging for justice, while lawyers mocked her poverty. They called her a gold digger, a nobody seeking attention. But when the sealed envelope was opened, revealing her true identity, their world shattered. Sometimes karma wears the mask of a beggar. If you believe justice always finds its way, smash that like button, and let's dive into this incredible story that will restore your faith in karma. Because what you're about to hear is so unbelievable, so perfectly orchestrated by fate itself, that it reads like fiction. But I promise you, every word is true. I'll never forget the first time I saw Elena Blackwood walk into that courthouse on a cold Tuesday morning in March. Of course, back then, none of us knew her real name. To everyone in that room, she was just Elena Morrison, a widow in her mid-40s, clutching a worn leather purse and wearing a coat that had seen better decades. Her graying hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and her shoes were so old they'd been resoled multiple times. She looked exactly like what everyone assumed she was: desperate, broke, and grasping at straws. The kind of person who shows up to court representing herself because she can't afford a real lawyer. The kind of person that corporate attorneys eat for breakfast. David Carter was that corporate attorney, tall, sharp-suited, with the kind of confidence that comes from never losing a case like this. He represented Sterling Construction, one of the biggest development companies on the East Coast. As Elena shuffled to her table, David was already smirking, checking his expensive watch like this was just another inconvenience in his day. Judge Patricia Wells called the court to order, and the case of Morrison versus Sterling Construction began. What should have been a simple wrongful death lawsuit was about to become something none of us could have imagined. Elena stood up, her voice barely above a whisper, as she began to tell her story. "Your Honor, my husband James Morrison died because of Sterling Construction's negligence. He was working on their downtown project when scaffolding collapsed. The safety inspector had warned them 3 times about violations, but they ignored him because fixing it would have cost them money." Her hands shook as she held up a folder of documents. James was a good man. He worked construction for 22 years, never missed a day, never cut corners. He didn't deserve to die because someone wanted to save a few $1,000s on safety equipment. David Carter rose with theatrical flair. "Your Honor, Mrs. Morrison's emotional appeal, while touching, ignores the facts. Her husband was working outside his assigned area when the accident occurred. He violated basic safety protocols. This was user error, not corporate negligence." The way he said it, so cold and clinical, made my stomach turn. But he wasn't done. Furthermore, David continued, his voice growing sharper, "Mrs. Morrison is seeking damages far beyond what her husband could have ever provided. James Morrison was a day laborer who earned maybe $30,000 a year on a good year. Yet she's asking for $2 million in damages. This isn't justice, Your Honor. This is opportunism." Elena's face flushed red, but she remained standing. James wasn't just a day laborer. He ran his own small contracting business. He had employees, contracts, a reputation. "Show me the business license," David interrupted. "Show me the tax returns. Show me any evidence that James Morrison was anything more than what he was, a man who worked with his hands for hourly wages." Elena fumbled through her papers, and I watched her confidence crumble in real time. The papers were lost in a fire last year, our apartment. But I have witnesses, people who worked with James, who knew what kind of man he was." David's laugh was cruel, convenient. "A fire that destroyed all evidence of this supposed business empire. Your Honor, I've investigated Mrs. Morrison's claims thoroughly. She lives in a 1-bedroom apartment in the poorest part of town. She works part-time at a grocery store. Her bank account has less than $300. Does this sound like the wife of a successful contractor?" The courtroom murmured with whispers and barely concealed laughter. I watched Elena's shoulders sag as the weight of public humiliation settled on her. This was exactly what David wanted. to make her look like a liar and a fool. Mrs. Morrison, Judge Wells said, not unkindly, do you have any documentation to support your claims about your husband's business? Elena's voice was barely audible. Your Honor, I know how this looks. I know what you all see when you look at me. But James was everything to me. He was good and honest and hardworking. And he died because Sterling Construction put profits over people. I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for justice. That's when David went for the killing blow. Your Honor, David said, his voice dripping with disdain. I think we need to address the elephant in the room. Mrs. Morrison claims to have been married to James Morrison for 5 years. Yet our investigation shows she has no employment history before that time. No address history, no credit history. It's as if Elena Morrison didn't exist before she met James. He pulled out a thick folder. What we do know is that she married a man with a modest life insurance policy and a small savings account. Within weeks of his death, she was consulting with personal injury lawyers. This isn't grief, Your Honor. This is premeditation. Elena shot up from her chair. That's not true. I loved James more than my own life. Then why, David continued relentlessly, did you insist on a private wedding ceremony with no guests? Why are there no photos of you together before your marriage? Why does your own marriage certificate list your previous address as confidential? What were you hiding, Mrs. Morrison? The courtroom was dead silent. Elena stood there, opening and closing her mouth like a fish out of water. Every question David asked painted her as a con artist, a woman who targeted a lonely widower for his meager assets. I had my reasons for privacy, she finally whispered. I'm sure you did, David replied smoothly. Your Honor, Sterling Construction sympathizes with anyone who has lost a spouse, but we cannot allow grief to be weaponized for financial gain. Mrs. Morrison has presented no credible evidence of negligence, no proof of her husband's alleged business success, and certainly no justification for the outrageous damages she's seeking. He gestured toward Elena with barely concealed disgust. Look at her, Your Honor. This is not a woman who lost a successful business partner. This is a woman who married an older man for security and now sees his death as a payday. We move for immediate dismissal. Elena sat down heavily, tears streaming down her face. The few people who had come to support her, Father Michael from the local church, Rosa Martinez, who had worked with James, looked as devastated as she did. But I noticed something else. In the back of the courtroom, a distinguished older man in his 70s had been sitting quietly through the entire proceeding. He wore an impeccable suit, carried a leather briefcase, and had been taking notes throughout David's character assassination. As Judge Wells prepared to render what looked like it would be a devastating verdict against Elena, the old man stood up. Your Honor, if I may, he said in a clear, cultured voice that commanded immediate attention. David spun around, clearly annoyed by the interruption. Excuse me, but who are you? The man walked forward with quiet dignity. Professor Benjamin Hayes, a state attorney. I represent certain interests related to this case, and I have documentation that I believe the court needs to see before rendering any judgment. Judge Wells frowned. Mr. Hayes, this case has already been fully presented. Unless you have new evidence directly related to the wrongful death claim, I do, Your Honor, evidence that will completely recontextualize everything we've heard today. David objected immediately. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. We haven't been given notice of any additional representation or evidence. This appears to be a desperate last-minute attempt to— Mr. Carter, Judge Wells interrupted. Let's hear what Mr. Hayes has to say. Professor Hayes opened his briefcase and removed a sealed envelope. Your Honor, the truth about Elena Morrison, or rather, Elena Blackwood Morrison, has been protected for 5 years by legal privilege and personal choice. But given the character assassination we've witnessed today, my client has authorized me to reveal information that will shock everyone in this courtroom. Elena looked up sharply, her eyes wide with what might have been panic or relief. Professor Hayes approached the bench. Your Honor, May I present Elena's true identity documents, which have been sealed and protected under attorney-client privilege for the past 7 years. David was on his feet immediately. Objection. This is clearly a fabricated attempt to— Mr. Carter, Judge Wells said firmly. Sit down. Mr. Hayes, present your evidence. Hayes handed the judge a thick folder. Elena Morrison is actually Elena Blackwood, the widow of tech billionaire Jonathan Blackwood, who died 8 years ago and left her an estate valued at over $3 billion. The courtroom erupted. People gasped, whispered, and turned to stare at Elena, who sat with her head down, tears still streaming. David's face went from confident to confused to pale in a matter of seconds. That's impossible. We investigated her background thoroughly. You investigated Elena Morrison, Hayes replied calmly. A legal identity she created after her husband's death to live a normal life away from the public eye. Your Honor, may I present the original marriage certificate between Elena Blackwood and Jonathan Blackwood, probate documents showing her inheritance, and financial records proving her current net worth. Judge Wells examined the documents with growing amazement. These appear to be authentic. Mrs. Blackwood, is this true? Elena finally looked up, and when she spoke, her voice was steady for the first time all day. Yes, Your Honor, Jonathan Blackwood was my first husband. When he died, I inherited everything. But I also inherited a life I never wanted. Constant media attention, people who only saw dollar signs when they looked at me. Endless requests for money from people who claimed to love me, but only loved my wealth. She wiped her tears and continued. So I legally changed my identity and moved across the country. I wanted to find out who I really was when money wasn't part of the equation. I got a job at a grocery store, rented a small apartment, and tried to live like a normal person for the first time in my life. David was frantically shuffling through papers, his confident demeanor completely shattered. That's where I met James. Elena continued, her voice growing stronger. He came into the store every Tuesday to buy flowers for his late wife's grave. We started talking, and for the first time since Jonathan died, I met someone who saw me as just Elena, not an heiress, not a widow worth billions. Just me. She looked directly at David. James never knew about my money, not until the day he died. I lived on my grocery store salary, drove a used car, wore second-hand clothes. We were happy with our simple life because our love was real. Professor Hayes stepped forward again. Your Honor, I have documentation showing that Elena has anonymously donated over $200 million to various charities over the past 5 years, including substantial grants to construction safety organizations and worker advocacy groups. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Elena had been secretly funding the very causes that might have saved her husband's life. But Hayes wasn't finished. Your Honor, there's more. Our investigation into Sterling Construction revealed something that makes this case even more extraordinary. He pulled out another set of documents. 3 years ago, Elena's charitable foundation made a grant of $15 million to Sterling Construction, specifically for improving worker safety protocols on construction sites. The courtroom went dead silent. Margaret Sterling, the company's CEO, who had been watching from the gallery, stood up sharply. That's impossible, she said. Our safety grant came from the Blackwood Foundation, but we were told it was from Jonathan Blackwood's estate, administered by his widow. Hayes finished. Elena Blackwood, the same woman your company's lawyer has spent the morning calling a gold digger and a fraud. David looked like he was going to be sick. The woman he had humiliated, the woman he had painted as a desperate opportunist, had literally given his client millions of dollars to prevent exactly the kind of accident that killed her husband. Elena stood up slowly. James died because Sterling Construction took my money for safety improvements and used it for executive bonuses instead. The scaffolding that collapsed was supposed to be replaced with funds from my grant. The safety inspector who warned them 3 times was supposed to be hired full-time with money I provided. She looked at Margaret Sterling with quiet fury. You let my husband die to pad your profit margins with money I gave you to save lives like his. Judge Wells was reading through the financial documents with increasing disbelief. Mrs. Blackwood, these records show that Sterling Construction received $15 million specifically earmarked for safety improvements. Can you prove these funds were misappropriated? Professor Hayes stepped forward with yet another folder. Your Honor, we've been investigating Sterling Construction's finances for months. The safety grant was deposited into their general fund and used for executive compensation, property purchases, and shareholder dividends. Less than 2% went to actual safety improvements. Margaret Sterling tried to speak, but Hayes cut her off. Furthermore, we have evidence that Sterling Construction has been systematically violating safety protocols while accepting grants and tax breaks meant to improve worker protection. David was completely silent now, staring at his client with growing horror as he realized the magnitude of what had happened. But Elena wasn't done. She reached into her worn purse and pulled out a thick envelope, setting it gently on the table. Your Honor, there's one more thing. Something that even Professor Hayes doesn't know. Hayes looked surprised for the first time all day. Elena's voice was steady now, filled with a quiet strength that commanded the room's attention. The day before James died, he came home from work very upset. He said his foreman had been asking questions about safety violations, and that someone from the company had told the workers to keep quiet about problems or they'd lose their jobs. She opened the envelope and pulled out a small recording device. James was worried about his crew's safety, so he started recording conversations at work. He wanted to have evidence in case something happened, and the company tried to cover it up. The courtroom was absolutely silent as Elena placed the recorder on the table. This recording was made the morning James died. It's a conversation between Sterling Construction supervisors discussing how to hide safety violations from the inspector who was coming that afternoon. Judge Wells leaned forward. Mrs. Blackwood, are you saying your husband recorded evidence of criminal negligence on the day he died? Yes, Your Honor. James hid this recorder in his toolbox. After the accident, the police gave me his personal effects. I found the recorder, but couldn't bear to listen to it until last week, when I finally did. Elena's voice broke slightly. James died trying to protect his fellow workers. He was documenting crimes that he knew could get people killed. Professor Hayes looked stunned. Elena, why didn't you tell me about this? Elena wiped her eyes. Because I wanted to hear Sterling Construction's defense first. I wanted to see if they would take responsibility for what they did. Instead, they chose to attack my character and claim James was at fault. She looked at David with something that might have been pity. You spent all morning trying to prove I was a fraud, but you never once tried to prove your client was innocent. Maybe that's because you knew they weren't. Judge Wells took the recording device. We'll need to have this authenticated and transcribed. But if this contains what you say it does, Mrs. Blackwood, it changes everything about this case. Margaret Sterling was frantically whispering to her lawyers, but David just sat there looking defeated. 3 weeks later, the courtroom was packed again, but this time, the atmosphere was completely different. The audio recording had been authenticated, and its contents were devastating. James Morrison's voice, captured on the morning of his death, documented not just safety violations, but active criminal negligence. Judge Wells read her verdict with gravity. In the matter of Morrison versus Sterling Construction, this court finds the defendant guilty of gross negligence, resulting in wrongful death. The evidence shows a pattern of criminal behavior that directly led to James Morrison's death. She looked at Elena with respect. Mrs. Blackwood, your husband died a hero. His documentation of these safety violations has already led to federal investigations at construction sites across the state. Because of James Morrison's courage, other workers' lives will be saved. The damages awarded were substantial, but Elena had already announced her intentions. Every penny would go to establishing the James Morrison Worker Safety Foundation, dedicated to protecting construction workers and their families. But the real karma was still unfolding. David Carter's law firm fired him the same day, citing his unprofessional conduct and failure to properly investigate a case. Margaret Sterling resigned in disgrace as federal investigators seized Sterling Construction's records. The company would eventually file for bankruptcy, unable to survive the lawsuits and criminal charges that followed. As for Elena, she returned to her small apartment that evening, billionaire by inheritance, but enriched beyond measure by James's love and sacrifice. 6 months later, I had the chance to interview Elena for this story. She was still living simply, still working part-time at the grocery store, still visiting James's grave every Tuesday. People ask me why I don't live like a billionaire, she told me as we sat in her modest living room. But wealth isn't about what you have. It's about what you choose to do with what you've been given. Jonathan left me money, but James left me purpose. She showed me a photo from their wedding, a small ceremony with just 2 witnesses, Elena in a simple white dress, James in his one good suit, both of them glowing with happiness. I could have told James about the money, she said. Maybe if I had, he would have quit that job and we'd both still be alive today. But then our love would always have that question mark hanging over it. This way, I know he loved me for exactly who I was when I had nothing to offer but myself. Elena established the foundation with $200 million of her own money. But it was James's courage that gave it meaning. His final recording didn't just expose one company's crimes. It sparked nationwide reforms in construction safety standards. The billionaire's secret wife became the billionaire's purposeful widow, using her wealth to honor her husband's sacrifice and protect the workers he died trying to save. Sometimes karma doesn't come as punishment for the guilty. Sometimes it comes as vindication for the innocent and justice for those who can no longer speak for themselves. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and share it with someone who needs to remember that truth always wins in the end. And remember, real wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the lives we touch and the love we leave behind. Elena Blackwood knew that better than anyone. She had 3 billion reasons to live differently, but she chose to live meaningfully instead. That's the difference between being rich and being wealthy. That's the difference between having everything and having enough.